Hello and welcome to Magnus Carlsen's last game at the Gashimov Memorial. This was a brilliantly played anti-Berlin, but he played the whole tournament with the strength of a player close to 3000 elu, which is quite amazing. Magnus is playing white, Sasha Grischuk is with the black pieces, and they played the Lopez. After the dreaded knight f6, Magnus chose d3, which is the antidote to the famous Berlin Wall. Grischuk played bishop c5, which is the most natural and aggressive square for that bishop, to which Carlsen replied c3, intending to break in the center with d4, and if black exchanges, then recapture with the c-pawn and have a stronger center than black. Castle, castle, and here d5 is a possibility. Aronian tried that 3 years ago against Magnus, but didn't go down well for him. Sasha plays the more cautious d6, which defends e5 and allows the bishop to get out of there. And here, almost any move works. Magnus decides to come back with the bishop to c2 to defend e4 and help with the idea of d4, so he played bishop a4. Since e5 is now defended with the pawn, Grischuk reroutes this knight to g6 before it maybe runs into d4, d5 stuff. The knight from g6 defends e5 just as well, and it might also jump to f4, where it would be close enough to the white king to say hello. So knight e7, bishop c2, knight g6, and d4 as expected. Now, black doesn't want to take here. That would be something called giving up the center. Black would give up his central e5 pawn for white's c3 pawn, and that would result in white having two central pawns versus one for black, and white would be better. Also, after c takes d4, the knight gains the c3 square. So, of course, Grischuk played instead bishop b6, and now a4 with the delicate threat of trapping the bishop. Grischuk made some room with c6, and this also helps with a d5 break. And now Magnus decides to fix the pawn structure before developing the remaining pieces. Bishop e3 would run into knight g4, and after h3 guarding g4, black can already break with d5, threatening to take on e4. Or if white takes on d5, then e4 and black would be better. Magnus could play knight d2, but it would just lead to an equal position after knight takes on e4, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and white even has an isolated pawn. Magnus maybe didn't want to play something like this. As we will see, he was actually in a fighting mood, and after c6, he went for d takes on e5. Knight takes, d takes e5, queen takes, and rook takes. And in this position, Magnus would like to play bishop e3, but the black bishop is guarding that, so he forced the bishop to make a decision with a5. After bishop c7, Magnus could play bishop e3, followed up by bishop c5. So Sasha preferred to maintain the bishop on the diagonal with bishop c5. b4 would temporarily force the bishop away from the diagonal, but since white didn't finish the development of the pieces yet, it would also overextend the queenside pawns and they would be vulnerable. Black could strike at them with c5. Also, after bishop e3 and knight g4, the bishop can't go to c5 anyway because black takes and ruins the pawn structure. So b4 is not very good. Magnus played instead knight d2 because he needs to finish development. Grischuk also develops the bishop, rook e1 defending e4, and now Sasha played b5, which is a good move. First of all, it adds more control over c4, a square the knight could get to at some point. And that pawn could also advance to b4 and take on c3, opening up some lines for the rooks, which, together with those beautifully developed bishops, could create some pressure on the queen side. But the move, of course, as any move actually, has also some downsides. the c5 square is weakened and could potentially become an outpost for the knight. But this is a very far-fetched plan. A more immediate problem is that it weakened a6, and after a6 by white, the knight could get deep into black's position via b3, a5 and b7. And that's the plan Magnus is going for because he played knight b3. Taking en passant is not good because it would open up the a file and white is underdeveloped compared to black. He would have to exchange the rooks and give up the a file, and only Grischuk would benefit from that. So Magnus played instead knight b3. And Grischuk makes a very important decision to give up his light square bishop to avoid all that stuff with the knight. But also he didn't want to move the nicely positioned dark squared bishop from c5. After bishop takes on b3 and the bishop recaptures, Sasha played knight g4 attacking f2. Magnus defends and now rook d6, threatening to take on f2 and then win the pinned rook with rook f6. Magnus prevents that with the very useful bishop g5, which not only stops rook f6, but also finishes development and prevents the rook going to d8. King f8 getting out of the spin, and rook f1 with the idea of playing f4 and opening some lines, and make the rooks and especially this light squared bishop count. Knight back to f6, g3 getting out of the spin and playing f4 next. a6, king g2, knight d7 planning to play f6, bishop back to c1, bishop back to a7 with the idea of c5, c4 and knight c5. f4, Magnus is already threatening to sack his bishop on f7 and then take on e5 with check, or just simply take on e5 and place the knight into an embarrassing pin. f6 and h4, trying to weaken some squares with h5 and h6. This is especially good now that black doesn't have a light squared bishop to cover the weakened light squares. Rook e8, h5, h6. And now that the expansion is stopped, black may finally get in c5, c4 or knight c5 hitting the bishop. So Magnus moves the bishop back to a2. c5, and now Magnus makes an interesting decision by playing bishop e3. Now that the bishop blocks the rook's view, he gives up the e4 pawn, but in exchange he pins the c pawn to the bishop, and more importantly the light square bishop will be even stronger on this diagonal. Magnus sacrificed the pawn in almost every game of the tournament and won, so it makes sense to try it in this game too. After pawn takes, f takes, rook takes on e4 and bishop b1, the rook went back to e7 to avoid further harassment on the light squares. And we can see that black's king side is like Swiss cheese, full of holes on the light squares. Magnus continued with rook e1, which prevents c4 from black, since now the rook on e2 is defended. And he is also having ideas like bishop g6 and mate black on e8. Magnus could also have ideas like bishop c5 with a triple attack on both rooks and the bishop on a7. But in this position that wouldn't work because of rook e2 with check. But it could happen after king f3, for example. Grischuk didn't want to wait for stuff like that and tries to get some activity, but unfortunately he makes his position worse after f5. Bishop takes knight f6, the point. The knight is going to d5 to attack something. But after king f3, knight e5 is just losing because of the very uncomfortable pin with rook d2. Magnus is threatening bishop e4 and winning the knight. Grischuk found the only way to keep the material with rook back, bishop e4, rook d7, rook d1, and now knight f6 defending the rook on d7. But after rook takes, Sasha is in very deep problems because after rook takes, and knight takes, bishop b2 wins the queenside pawns. After knight b8, defending a6, b4 is strong, and black loses the c5 pawn. And then this one is marching towards queenhood. So instead of taking with the rook, Grischuk recaptured with the knight, but after rook d6, he resigned because he still loses the a-pawn, and after that, the others too. A fantastic game and a fantastic tournament by our world champion Magnus Carlsen, whose performance, play and attitude in Shamkir is a nice homage paid to the late Vugar Gashimov, who was the 6th strongest player in the world in 2009 at only 23 years old, but had to leave us 4 years later because of a brain tumor. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other videos, maybe you will like them. Thanks for watching and see you soon.